your central point, or at least your initial point, is so obviously clarifying with respect to how, there's a fundamental paradox that anybody who's thought about the question of free speech has to grapple with, which is you effectively either forego all moderation and you create an instant dystopia because of all the terrible things that can happen, or you sign up for some level of moderation. And then the point is you become responsible for where you draw that line. And there's no good way to make everyone happy. But your point, if I understand you correctly, is that there's actually a very natural place to draw a line that will not make everyone happy, but it is maximally likely to be useful as a first stroke on the canvas. And that, you want to lay it out?
Sure. And because there's so much of the reaction to the idea of Musk taking over Twitter was extremely simplistic. And I actually quote in the article two experts, world-class experts, saying, "Oh, Elon's going to have no moderation at all. It's going to be the law of the jungle, et cetera," right? And he had previously laid out on the TED Talk, which I have a link to in the essay, that he obviously knows there has to be some moderation. So I thought about it a little bit and said, all right, how can we explain this? What is lacking in this conversation? And I realized it was frankly a simple ontology and vocabulary problem. Because people are thinking simplistically, moderation, yes, moderation, no, free speech, absolutist, totalitarian fascist dictatorship. Nope, wrong. And so the ontology I laid out, the vocabulary I laid out, is to distinguish first content moderation from what I call decorum moderation. Decorum could also be called behavior. Basically, decorum, which I talk about first, is analogous to manners in the real world. I use the example, for instance, we might share the gory details of our most recent dating debacle with our close friends over a few drinks, but we're probably not likely to do that at our grandmother's Sunday dinner table. And the distinction between manners with our friends over drinks and manners at our grandmother's dinner table correspond to decorum rules in different kinds of online venues. For instance, a family-oriented online system like Disney might have one set of decorum rules. A more serious one like Twitter for adults might have a different set, and 8chan might have an entirely different one. And it's absolutely key to the success of a platform that you think about what who your audience is, what your purpose is, and you craft a decorum set of decorum rules and decorum moderation that's appropriate for what you want. In a case like Twitter and many more or less mainstream ones, some of the obvious forms of decorum are no racial slurs directed at people. I prefer the rule of no personal attacks directed at another person that's a member of the community. There's some funny ones like Facebook has a rule, no nipples. The only time I ever got a sanction until I got banned by Facebook was I posted a story about kind of hippie communes, and on the picture that was pulled forward, there was a 4-year-old child with long hair, couldn't tell the gender or the sex, to be more precise, and nipples were showing. So Facebook kicked it. So that's decorum. You can be absurd and ludicrous like Facebook is, or you can be smart and be and enumerate what it is that we are not going to allow. In our Game B online home, for instance, we have one death penalty rule, which is if you direct obscene language at another member, you will be terminated instantly, period. As an example of a decorum rule, which we enforce. And it actually was named after a specific user who was the cause for it. And so if we think about, and the other thing about decorum is it's viewpoint neutral. Whether you're talking about Trump or whether you're talking about Bernie, you can say so using decorum without attacking other people. If the rules for this particular platform were saying, they could use the George Carlin, no 7 dirty words, or I'd be out of luck because I don't know how to talk without using the 7 dirty words. But one could imagine a platform that might choose to do that. You could talk about anything with decorum. I like to point out the Beatles never said fuck in any of their songs, right? And yet they were pretty revolutionary dudes. And so you can, decorum and then the other side, content, are two different worlds. If you make that divide cleanly, I think you get rid of an awful lot of the confusion that the discussion around moderation falls into in the simplistic all or nothing perspective.
Yeah, I would say it's likely to be, who knows whether there's actually a justification for this, but you might find that it's a Pareto, you've nailed 80% of what people want protected versus what people want excluded with the single stroke. Now, I want to take you to two places here. First off, there's bound to be some confusion. I have described myself as a free speech absolutist, but I am for a solution like the one you describe, and I would reconcile those two things in this way. In environments like those historically that have existed, one does not need absolute rules over decorum because they are effectively agreements in a community about what is and is not tolerable behavior, and they're obviously there's variation, but the basic point is certain things are outside of what this community typically tolerates, and one can simply infer those. And in fact, you might be very much in favor of those rules of decorum, as I am, and very much against absolute rules, posted on the door that say what will happen to you if you violate this rule. The basic point is we don't want this to be authoritarian. We want it to be voluntary. And the point is, you can't have it be voluntary in a space like Twitter, right? We're not anywhere down near Dunbar's number. We're so many orders above it, or orders of magnitude above it, that what could be done informally in another context must be done formally at the level of something like Twitter. And so a free speech absolutist is not saying everybody should say everything that crosses their mind at all moments, right? What they are saying is that we want to be very careful not to create any limit that could potentially eliminate some kind of valuable perspective. We need to protect all sorts of speech that may not be obviously valuable in order to make sure to catch everything that is valuable. So
let me go on to the other distinctions, if you don't mind.
Yep.
So decorum, and again, different sites will have different decorums, and I'll sort of finish up on what you were talking about. In a face-to-face community, it's generally speaking implicit, and also interestingly, you have skin in the game. If you're in my face talking about my mother, guess what? I might punch you in the nose, right? Somebody sitting in their mother's basement typing away on their computer 3,000 miles from nowhere. You don't have that skin in the game. And so
you have two things. There's skin in the game, right? Like
literally skin in the game.
There's literally skin in the game. You might take a punch if you say the wrong thing. There's also reputation, right? It is not so diluted by the number of users or the anonymity or any of these other features.
Correct. Yeah, if you're part of a face-to-face community and you're known as the asshole that, just dishes shit to everybody, nobody invites you to any events anymore, and they cross the street when they see you coming. In a community of the Dunbar number of 150 plus, or plus times two maybe. So now let's go on to the next distinction, which we have content versus decorum, and that's a pretty bright line. Yeah, there's a few edge cases, but if you stop and think, is this a decorum question or is this a content question? It's usually pretty clear. Now in content, I have a second distinction that's a little muddier, which is between actually inherently bad content that, again, most everybody would agree is bad, though there'll be some corner cases. For instance, attacks on privacy, doxing, right? The advocacy of imminent violence against specific people or groups, the advocacy for the committing of serious crimes. Now, it's interesting. I make a distinction in the article about serious crimes because I might well allow advocacy for civil disobedience, right? If people want to go out in the street and march without a permit and get arrested for blocking traffic, at least if I were designing the rules for Twitter, I would not rule that out. On the other hand, if someone were to be advocating murder or bank robbery and, in a very specific way, we might roll that out. So there are some judgment cases on there. And then the other content in this sense, dangerous content, inherently dangerous content, could include, detailed descriptions of how to make bombs or poisons or how to kill yourself or things of that ilk. So that's that bundle. And, each system will make its own decisions about that. I'm reasonably confident Elon will come up with some reasonable set of choices. They're probably more liberal than many people might, but it's not going to be insane. It's the third bucket, which is what I believe Elon actually cares about and which could be so important to help our world become a better place. And that's what I call point of view moderation. And point of view means, what is it that you are trying to deliver, that you are trying to say, the substance? Are you trying to say capitalism bad, communism good? Are you trying to say trout fishing is more fun than bass fishing? You have some substance that you're trying to deliver, and that's your point of view. And my perspective, and I'm with you here, I'm pretty close to an absolutist on good faith point of view. As I give an example in the essay that all the platforms ganged up simultaneously and booted the QAnon folks in late 2020 and very early 2021. Frankly, I think the QAnon folks are ass clowns, and the chances of their ideas being correct are essentially zero, or at least most of their ideas are essentially zero. But then as I said, I also say the same thing about Christianity, astrology, and Marxist-Leninism. And, I don't consider it right to ban those three just because I don't like them, right? And I think they're false and I think they're bad. And I do believe they're both false and bad, all three of them.
Yeah, although I've heard you say, and I agree, that there are things in Marx's critique of the way capitalism functions that are well worth discussing.
Sure. And Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is a goddamn good set of moral lessons, right?
Absolutely, right. And so that's an important thing for those who want a bright line to recognize, is that in the case that something has value, but it's not all of one nature, how are you going to draw that line? And so what you're saying is you draw that line liberally because you need to be able to hash it out.
If it's good faith, if it's presented in good decorum, if it isn't obviously imminently dangerous and not in the kind of the new sense of safety bullshit, we can talk about that some, then let the ideas flow. And this is what I believe to be Elon's actual motivation. And, really hard for me to think about where in a point of view, one would stop. And again, this is to you were alluding to this earlier. Yes, there's some bad ideas will float around. QAnon, Marxist-Leninism. Let's just give, two examples. But the attempt to pick and choose amongst ideas inevitably leads to the squelching of these fresh shoots that we need. And I was in an email conversation with somebody today, and they were going, blah, 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 democracy. People were able to say whatever they want to be the end of democracy. And I pointed out to them, did you realize that when the American founding, democracy was a bad word? The founders went out of their way to say that what they had created was not a democracy. It was a mixed republic, which was actually true. It wasn't until 1800 or so, when Jefferson and his Democratic Republican Party got underway, that democracy even became something other than an embarrassing word. And very partisan newspapers campaigned democracy for a number of years. And finally, democracy was more or less consolidated in 1824 with the election that Andrew Jackson narrowly lost to John Quincy Adams. And so the thing that he thought he was defending, democracy, is actually a perfect example where upstart insurgents waged mimetic warfare for 24 years before they actually consolidated the idea that America was a democracy. And so if we're allowing the peculiar oligarchs who control these platforms to stomp on fresh ideas, no telling what fresh ideas might be being stomped on. And I believe that it's the fresh ideas that are going to save humanity and help guide us help us navigate ourselves towards a better place, rather than the old tired ideological ideas from the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And so truthfully, at bottom, that's why I'm a point of view near absolutist, is that I'm so afraid that reflexive defense of the status quo ends up killing the ideas that we're going to need to save ourselves. And putting up with some bad ideas in circulation is a price worth paying to be able to harvest the fruits of those fresh little sprouts when they grow up.
Yeah, this is an issue near and dear to my heart on many different fronts, right? This is something that is now happening in the realm of science. It's obviously happening in our political discussions. And once you spot the following puzzle, it's obvious that you can't go about this the way we're doing it. The puzzle is the fringe is mostly garbage. It is therefore reasonable, if you wanted to get an algorithm to bet on things, just simply reflexively betting against the fringe is a winner in general, but it's not a very big winner. And what it does is it guarantees that you will neuter all of the things on which progress is based. In other words, all of the status quo stuff that works arose on the fringe, and it became mainstream. And so effectively, this reflexive betting against the fringe, the dismissing of everyone on the fringe as a kook or a crank or a quack or whatever, is the end of progress, right? This is it is beyond conservative. It is reactionary, and it doesn't matter which side it's coming from. That's just its nature. And in fact, it's coming from self-interest. People who are trying to protect themselves from competitors who have yet to have risen will, invoke this need to do quality control of the fringe because there's so much garbage there. But the point is, the founding fathers were fringe, right? Now,
right, they were. The Enlightenment was fringe
right.
in 1725, right? Science was considered heretical, literally. People were burned at the stake or imprisoned for life. Galileo spent the last years of his life under house arrest for being the first real scientist.
Right. So it's effectively, are you for or against explosions? Well, I guess in general, I don't want explosions, but, internal combustion engines run on explosions. So if I rule out explosions, I've caused a problem. And, in this case, we have to protect the fringe, even though we also have to acknowledge that it is true. Most of what is on the fringe is garbage in every era. That's always been true. And the thing that has never been solved is how you can go to the fringe and sort between that which is ahead of its time and that which is truly nonsense. Right.
And our complexity lens would tell us you can't.
You can't.
Right?
It can't be done.
Because the unfolding of a complex system is unpredictable very many steps out. So, something wackadoodle like game B, right? Is that the answer? I think it is, but truthfully, could I prove it? Hell no. And the only way you're going to find out is to watch the world unfold. Either game B will change the world for the good or it'll disappear, right?
Right. And in some sense, I hate to say the sentence because I know that it will potentially invite all kinds of nonsense, but I think you and I would both agree that in effect, in order to protect something potentially important like game B, you also have to protect nonsense like QAnon.
Exactly. Right? That was the point I was trying to make.
Yep.
If your job is to, if your reflex, and even worse on Facebook, where they actually write algorithms to do this, if your algorithms essentially are targeting anything that is anti-status quo, as you'll say, we'll never have progress. This is what happened to China, interestingly, in the late Ming era, where they had the biggest ships in the world. They went as far as Cape of Good Hope, and then they got their institutions got captured by this hyper reactionaryism. They burned all the treasure ships, and they basically fell into centuries of passive nothingness, and then had their butts kicked when the Europeans and the Japanese emerged and collided with them in the late 18th and early 19th century. And only now have they recovered. And that can happen to a society. It can just say, no change, no change. And
yes,
that's a prescription for disaster.
In fact, my understanding of that chunk of history is that it is very likely, maybe even near certain, that if the Chinese had not done that instead of the Europeans showing up in the Americas, it would have been the Chinese, and it would have changed the history of the world. So anyway, yes, we need to be incredibly cautious about imagining that any rule of thumb is good enough to deal with the problem of a fringe that is mostly garbage, but is also the incubator for all of the most important ideas of the future that none of us can spell out yet, right?
And to just speak to your own field, as we know, the vast preponderance of mutations are bad. Right. The vast preponderance, I don't know, pick a number, 99.9, right? But guess what? We'd still be single cell bacteria or archaea if it wasn't for mutations.